IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm the host for today, Suman. And in today's episode, we are discussing a topic that is interesting as always, and that one that has sparked a lot of debate. The one number that all economic policy watchers, or generally people tracking any economy, really look at is the gross domestic product, GDP. Now, why is this important? What is the controversy this time around? And how should we look at this? To discuss all of this and to give us a primer of the topic itself, I have with me my colleague Sarthak, who will take us through this whole thing in this discussion. Hi, Sarthak. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Suman. Glad to be here.
Before we discuss the present controversy, can you just tell us what is GDP, just so that we get the basics right?
Yeah, Suman. The ultimate objective of any economic activity is to provide goods and services that the population desires. But how do you know how much of these goods and services are being produced? So the GDP is the most comprehensive measure of the total output, total goods and services that are produced in the economy. It counts all the output generated within the borders of a country. And it basically measures the market value, the monetary value of all final goods and services that are produced within a country in a particular time period. It can be a year, it can be a quarter. And GDP tends to be a very significant indicator, right? Tells you which direction the economy is moving, right? Whether it is contracting, whether it is expanding. And accordingly, policymakers, central bankers, right? They can take the appropriate measures, right? For instance, if the economy is going in a particular direction, right? Let's say there's a possibility of recession, right? You need to provide a boost maybe. Or in some instances, the economy needs to be restrained. Apart from that, the GDP is also significant because it can give you an idea of where the economy stands right now as compared to other countries. So this is how GDP is significant, and this is what GDP tends to do.
Yeah, so if all the major decisions that policymakers are going to take based on this one number, then we get the significance of it. Sure, it may have some defects or, some shortcomings in the sense that it may not be measuring very adequately the unorganized sector or so, but it gives a fair indicator about how the economy is doing. Right? So, but how do you calculate this GDP? How is GDP measured actually?
Yeah, so there are three different approaches by which GDP can be measured. One is the expenditure approach, right, where you just sum all that everyone is spending in the economy over a particular period. For instance, what is the household consumption? How much is the government spending? How much are the businesses investing? And what is the net exports, right? Exports minus imports. If you total all these things, it gives you an idea of the size of the economy. That's one approach, expenditure approach. Another thing that you can do is maybe total all the incomes of the people, right? When you are producing something, and in that process, right, there will be different kinds of incomes generated. For instance, the labor will be paid wages. Some people will make profits. There will be rent paid to the land. There will be interest, right? So if you sum total all these things, then also you'll get the GDP. This is called the income approach. The third approach is the value-added approach, where you are measuring the aggregate value that is added across all sectors of the economy. So you have the expenditure approach, you have the income approach, you have the value-added approach. But the interesting point here is, whichever approach you use, ideally, right, you should get the same number, right? So the GDP will be same irrespective of the method that you use. But there can be Some issues sometimes. We'll come to that in a while. But yeah, in ideal circumstances, each of these approach should give you the same number.
So does that mean that if we have a GDP number, it just gives us the perfect position or the perfect picture of the health of the economy?
Okay, so here there are two things. One is, again, GDP gives you an idea about how much production is happening in the economy, right? How much goods and services are produced. It will not tell you about certain other things. For instance, it will not tell you what is the quality of GDP growth, maybe. It will not tell you about environmental impact, maybe, because again, environmental impact is also a part of economy. You will not get those kind of sense from here. It will not tell you about maybe the standard of living of the people. Maybe the GDP is growing. You might have a very high per capita GDP, but standard of living might not be very good. Again, standard of living is part of economy, but GDP might not be able to capture that. Or within the economy, how the incomes are distributed, right? Inequality, right? Again, part of economy, but GDP might not be able to capture it. So GDP, what it is expected to do, it does that, right? It gives you an idea about how much goods and services are being produced. But then there are other components in the economy. For that, we have different kinds of measures. Possibly those measures are better to gauge those particular parameters, right? For instance, if you want to understand what is the level of inequality, maybe you should use the Gini coefficient. Yeah. If you want to find out what kind of standard of living people have, then you have other indicators, HDI and all those things. For environmental impact, again, you have different ways to figure that out. So this is one aspect. Now, another thing, see, GDP tries to figure out how much goods and services are produced in the economy, but then there are sometimes issues because of which you cannot capture some of these good services that are being produced. For instance, unpaid work or care work, right? All those things are not captured. And apart from that, you might also have a economy which is kind of that underground economy, right? Accounting is not there. So all those things might not be captured in GDP. But here also there is one thing. GDP growth, if you are looking at, right? So GDP growth did not necessarily require all these things, right? You are just comparing whichever part of the economy you are able to count with, over time, right? So GDP, if you're measuring just GDP growth, you don't need to measure those aspects, maybe.
Okay. So coming to the current issue on hand. Okay. So the ministry under the NSO and the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, they released the economic data for the first quarter of the year, and they showed that this showed that India's economy grew by 7.8% in quarter one. So now, immediately after that, there was this huge hue and cry saying these numbers are not right and they're not well represented, and so on and so forth. So, what is the issue with measurement? What is the current issue about? Is it just a data gathering thing, or is there more to it than meets the eye?
Yeah. So what happened was the NSO, as you mentioned, right? It released the data for quarter 1, 23-24 for first 3 months of this fiscal year, right? April, May, June. And according to that, the economy grew at around 7.8%. And after that, again, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, the General Secretary of Congress, he had tweeted that we are possibly overstating the GDP by around 1%. But it is not just Mr. Jairam Ramesh who talked about it. Other economists, for instance, Mr. Arvind Subramaniam, Ashok Modi, they also have pointed out how there have been variations in the GDP measurement, right? If the GDP numbers vary, if you use different kind of methods. And it's not just a new thing. In the last couple of years, there have been papers which have tried to look at this. In fact, there was one paper by the ex-chief economic advisor, Mr. Arvind Subramaniam. He had pointed out that India might be overstating its GDP by 2.5%. Right. So, yes, recently it was in the news, but it has been in the news in the past as well. Now, we can actually break it down into a couple of components. Now, first thing is, how do we measure GDP, right? As I was mentioning, there are different methods. You can You can basically total whatever people are spending in the economy, or you can find out what is the income of different sections in the economy, and you can total all these things, and both ways you should get the same number. The GDP should be same. So in an ideal scenario, these numbers, the data that you get from any of these methods, right, it should be same. But in real life scenario, it might not be the case. Also, for the time window, right, you are trying to get the results, right, you might not have data. So data availability can be an issue. Let's say for some sectors, you got the data immediately. For some other, you might get the data later on, right? Later on you will revise it, but if you are coming up with the GDP at the end of the quarter, let's say, right, so you might not have the exact numbers. So there might be a mismatch if you are calculating GDP from using one method with another method. And if there is a mismatch, then again, all those things will be put under a separate category, miscellaneous discrepancy. So this happens, but the issue this time is that discrepancy seems to be quite huge. Another issue is related to how you account for inflation. It might so happen that in an economy, the production does not increase, but the prices of the goods and services increases. Let's say if an economy consists of different kinds of goods and services, the same amount of goods and services are produced the next year itself, but the price of each good and service has increased by 5%. So in that case, what will happen? The total size of the economy has increased by 5%. But can we say that the economy grew by 5%? Most likely not, right? That's not the economic growth we would want. It's just rise in prices. So
that's the distinction between nominal GDP and real GDP.
Yeah. So in real GDP, yes, exactly. In real GDP, what we need to do is we have to discount for inflation. We have to look at the inflation rates and we have to deduct it from the growth rates, right? But again, here, how we account for inflation becomes important. And there can be some amount of subjectivity, right? What sort of inflation variable you are using to arrive at the real GDP numbers. So you use basically a deflator to get the real GDP data from the nominal GDP data. This deflator needs to be representative of the actual inflation. If the deflator is not representative of the actual inflation, you might end up with a wrong estimate. And at this point of time, this is also the criticism that the deflator seems to be too low. The nominal GDP growth rate is 8%. The real GDP growth rate is 7.8%. Just 0.2%. That's how inflation is. Many people will not agree with it. The CPI inflation numbers have been high, 4.7%, 4.3%, 4.9%. But the deflator is saying it is 0.2%. And
yes.
Yeah, and the reason is because we don't use CPI numbers. We rather use a combination of the consumer price index as well as the wholesale price index. And the wholesale price index has been in the negative.
If we had used only the wholesale price index, then we would have had a higher GDP, I'm guessing, because if it is in the negative,
yes,
then if you had a 7.8, then you would have had to do addition to that, which would make it 8%, which is also not correct.
Yeah, so the real GDP growth rate would have been higher than the nominal GDP growth rate in that case. Yeah. Again, which doesn't add up.
Okay, let's take a break at this point in time. Once we come back, we'll delve a little more into the details of the deflator itself, of other things within to understand GDP better.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the GDP, the number that has been put out by the NSO. And we've also been discussing various facets of the GDP, how GDP is measured, what is the problem with, or what is the controversy around this times number. Okay, but just going back a little, this is not the first time that the GDP methodology is in the news. There have been some criticisms, a lot of discussion around this as well. What have been the reasons for this recurring criticism? Is it just debate, or are there solid grounds for criticizing the way the numbers have been put out.
Yeah, so thanks for pointing this out, Suman. So, first thing, again, I was mentioning about deflator, but this controversy around deflator has been there before as well. For instance, one of the issue that we have here is the wholesale price index, as you yourself were mentioning just some time back. The wholesale price index is saying something and the consumer price index is saying something else. The wholesale price index has been in the negative and the consumer price index has been hovering somewhere around 4.5%. Ideally, what should happen is the change in wholesale prices should get transmitted into consumer prices, right? One should lead to another. But that typically doesn't happen, right? Wholesale price index is saying something that there is no inflation. Consumer price index is saying that there is inflation. And what could be the reason for this? Somewhere, I mean, the kind of goods that we are considering for wholesale prices, they are extremely different from the kind of goods that we have as part of the consumer price index basket. In fact, if you look at all the kind of commodities that are part of the wholesale price index basket, right, it's mostly manufactured goods. While the consumer price index, it has mostly food products and also it has services, by the way. So if I'm getting a haircut or if my haircut is becoming more expensive, banking transactions are becoming more expensive, all these things will get reflected in the consumer price index. And no way that will be there in the wholesale price index. So
is that why you've not had a haircut in some time?
Yeah. No, I just got my haircut a couple of days back, so your data is wrong. And coming to that, I mean, we'll come to the data issues also in a bit. And apart from that, wholesale price index doesn't account for the rural-urban variation, state level information. So again, there have been different kinds of. A lot of people have argued whether we should. Change our wholesale price, the basket for wholesale price index, we should reconsider it. And again, if you're considering it as a part of the deflator, again, we have to figure out how we need to include that. Another thing, this is something which Mr. Arvind Subramaniam had also written some time back in his paper. So he looked at the GDP data between 2011 to 2016, and he also looked at the GDP data before that. And what he observes or what his paper finds out is there is a massive divergence between the path that the GDP takes and the different kinds of macroeconomic indicators. And for the period 2011 to 2016. Before 2011, again, there is convergence, but after that, it is not. Ideally, what should happen? If the GDP is doing well, right? If it is increasing, that means there should be more exports, investment should be better, credit should be better, all these things. There should be increase in that. But that is not the case. Huge divergence between the macroeconomic indicators and the GDP. Also, he compares all these things with 6-country average, right, of some of the emerging economies. So India's GDP declined far less than the 6-country average, despite India's macroeconomic indicators being worse hit. And he also does some estimate that India is overestimating its GDP growth by 2.5 percentage points. So this is again another issue, right? Ideally, there should be some sort of convergence between macroeconomic indicators and GDP, which is also not happening. And third thing, the discrepancy that we were talking about, right? So using the expenditure method, we have got a particular number. Using the income method, we have got another number, right? Using the expenditure method, the GDP size is somewhere around some 69 lakh crore. Using the income method, the GDP is more than 7 lakh crore. We are automatically assuming that whichever is higher is the GDP. Right. So again, that might not be the correct assumption to make. So this is also something that is being pointed out.
Okay, so since now we know, we have a grasp of what the problem is and where the problems lie, what should be the way ahead?
Yeah, as we have been discussing some of these things, and as you've also mentioned about data somewhere. So first thing is we need to look at the underlying data, right? So if you need to get the best or better GDP estimates, I'm not saying best GDP, rather the estimate of GDP should be best, then we need to look at the underlying data. right? For instance, WPI or consumer expenditure. All these data we need to figure out whether they are representative of what they are supposed to measure. Right, wholesale price index, it should be representative of what it is supposed to measure. Consumer expenditure or consumer inflation should be representative of how the inflation is felt by consumers. Many of these baskets have not been revised, so it needs to be revised. You can get the right estimates only when you do all these things, and if you don't do it, then again the credibility of your numbers will depend on all these things. Another
And
thing that
policy making will depend. Yeah, and policy making will just be based on wrong or incorrect assumptions, which will again have its own problems, right?
Yeah, exactly. And one more thing, I mean, see, GDP gives you an idea about all these things, right? But there can be other ways by which also you can figure out how the economy is doing, right? There can be other proxies for economic activity. So definitely GDP is the most comprehensive one, but use other indicators as well. So maybe for instance, right, night lights and all those things are new kind of indicators. Other macro indicators that we are talking about, investment credits, maybe look at that. Vehicle sales, so they also give you an idea about how the economy is doing. So don't just focus on, I mean, whoever is taking decisions, which is going to impact significant number of people. Don't base your decisions only on the GDP estimates. Look at other things as well.
To corroborate.
Yes, exactly. Some sort of triangulation of data you're trying to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarthak. This was informative. I hope all our listeners find this useful and look at the GDP numbers next time they come out with a more careful eye on it and try to understand this better. Thanks, and we'll come back with another episode in a few weeks' time. Thank you.
Thanks, Suman. Thanks to the audience.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.